This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Xyzal is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Xyzal keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all, take Xyzal. At night.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day. And that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
You know, what I think about a lot is the Abigail Folger seeing, Susan Atkins walking around the house and just waving to her, and she waved back because it was the 60s and you could easily find somebody wandering around your house barefoot and long-haired and you'd wave at them. It is like something out of a horror movie. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's lasted, I think.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be talking to Ian Cooper, who is a writer of long standing and has two books that we're going to look at today, and two topics which to me seem to be interrelated. And we were just talking off mic, Ian, that they kind of mix and mingle as well, these subjects, right?
Sure, yeah.
First of all, though, Ian, I really want to talk about how you got into writing. What was your entry into writing about film?
I was teaching film in London quite a long time, and I'd written various bits of things for film guides and things like that. And I got married to a German, and she said she had a good job offer in Germany and I could move here and write full time, which I hadn't really thought about. I mean, I kind of thought, yeah, it'd be good to write screenplays or books or whatever. And so I started when we moved here, and I wrote quite a lot of stuff quite quickly because I didn't have a job. I could kind of just sit here. I was in a village. I didn't speak German. We didn't have the internet. So it was kind of a bit like The Shining, without the axe murders. That's really how it happened.
Although I'm always disappointed in how few axe murders there actually are in The Shining. I do call me sick, but that is one film which has a paucity of killing.
Yeah, well, but the one there is pretty dramatic. So
True. Poor Chef Holleran. I mean, yeah. He spends all that time in that. How long is it to fly from Miami to Denver and then through the snow and.
And then just gets killed straight away.
I mean, he's basically shipped in as the only victim, basically.
Well, they've got to kill somebody, and they can't kill Wendy or Danny, so I guess,
I think let's go with Charles Manson first, because this is a perennial topic. This is something that has been that every few years, and in your book on Manson in television and in film. What surprised? Well, it didn't really surprise me, but almost instantly, it's creating its own sort of fictional avatars and versions. It's almost like within weeks, this is happening.
Yeah. Well, the first Manson movie, John Waters' Multiple Maniacs, he started shooting that before they'd caught the family. The day before he finished shooting, they made the arrests, so he put this famous headline, "Weirdos Arrested in Tape Murder." In Multiple Maniacs, one of the characters is tormented by his partner that he killed the most beautiful girl in Hollywood. So it's like, even before there was a Manson family in the media, there was the Tate murders in film, I mean, it's incredible, really, yeah. I mean, exploitation movies have always been really good at exploited. But I think with the Manson murders, I think especially if you compare them to something like the Moors murders in Britain, which were these kind of incredibly depressing, in the north of England, murders of children. The Manson murders had it all. It's like they've got acid and naked hippie chicks and violence and Hollywood. And Manson was this great villain. So it's kind of perfect for exploitation filmmakers. It's got everything, really.
And it's not really a decided narrative as well. I mean, this is what partly the Errol Morris documentary Chaos is about, and maybe much more the book on which it's based, is that narrative is actually really up for grabs. That there's a lot of conspiracy theories, and you can go with the helter-skelter theory, or you can, I think at one point you say that Manson can be seen from the right as being the demonic hippie, and he can be seen from the left as this sort of racist Nazi, basically.
Yeah, it's really interesting how at first there was this. I think it's a sign of how deeply weird that period was in America, that some people thought that the Manson murders were this kind of revolutionary act, and on the far left, people thought, yeah, he's this kind of class warrior, or conversely, that he was framed. I mean, I think this isn't in the book because I found out recently, but as late as 1974 or 5, when Jack Nicholson was making Cuckoo's Nest, he gave an interview to Rolling Stone where he said Manson was, quote, railroaded. So it's like, if you didn't think he was a revolutionary warrior, then you thought he was framed. And, that's something obviously which carries on into the Morris and the O'Neill versions of it, that Manson was a bit of a patsy. So yeah, and he's really quite an iconic figure on the far right. It's really confusing because James Mason is the name of the fascist who really sees Manson as this kind of Christ figure, and every time you mention it, you have to say James Mason, not the actor.
Or you could just not say that, and people could just have an image in their head
that would be a story, yeah. Someone
with a wonderful voice going, yeah. I think Charles Manson was.
I think the thing is, because Manson has this kind of Hollywood, he was on the fringes of Hollywood, so it is kind of plausible that it could be that James Mason. And I don't want to kind of libel because I like James Mason. I like the actor, not the fascist.
again, we have to clarify.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, what I found about the different versions of Charles Manson, and there's the one was quite recent one directed by Mary Harron. Charlie Says, with Matt Smith in the role, who is so poorly cast, because if there's one defining aspect of Manson, it's the fact that he's so small, and they put in this lanky beanpole as his to play him. There's this idea as well that somehow there are things around him where he's got to be brought down to size, metaphorically, like for instance his music career, and the thing that's interesting is sort of the Mary Harron film sort of suggests this guy's actually not very good and he's completely deluded in his musical ambition, whereas the Morris documentary kind of has people on record going, he almost made it, he was almost, he was in the room with the right people.
I think Bobby Beausoleil was right when he said that the Manson songs people hear, he kind of made up as nonsense songs for the family to sing together around the campfire. And so, they were kind of childlike, like nursery rhymes. Beausoleil also said that Manson was a kind of proto-rapper because he would change lyrics all the time, and he would do this kind of, rap, and he was kind of that weird, I don't want to say articulate, but, he could spin a yarn. And Neil Young said that he was a song spewer, not a singer. And of course, the Beach Boys did also record one of his songs. And, the Beach Boys weren't, are not to be sniffed at. So I think it's sort of fashionable to make out that his music is like Hitler's paintings, But I do think there's quite he definitely had talent. Whether he had enough, I mean, that's interesting in the Morris documentary where they keep saying he was nearly there, but he wasn't. But I don't see him as any worse than somebody like Richie Havens, who, had this massive career in the 60s.
The interviews that you see with him and the way he sort of performs there is there's a knowingness. I mean, you talk about him rapping and him sort of doing this sort of stream of consciousness almost idea. It reminds me a little bit of Russell Brand, but potentially the first time that's been pointed out. But that he had this sort of way of being sort of ineptly loquacious that he put unfamiliar words in sentences so that you were going, oh, hang on a minute, how did that? You sort of have to backtrack to see if it makes any sense or not, or whether he's just dazzling you with verbiage.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of that. We're referring to prison as the hallways of always is a fantastic quote. And I keep coming back a lot of the time to his phrase, no sense makes sense, which, it's either seductive nonsense or there is actually something there. And I'm not even sure whether he knew the difference. And I think it's partly because he was kind of articulate, but he wasn't educated. So it's very much a sense of his rough edges weren't filed off at any point. And I think a big key to the way Manson talked, and I sort of feel like this is not really explored by enough writers. He was institutionalized from very young, and he was very short and he's very skinny. So he's got to find some sort of survival mechanism. And one of them obviously was this, Jeff Gwynne calls it the crazy game, where he learned to seem like a lunatic. But also I think he learned to tell a good story, learned to kind of captivate people the same way as loads of bullied people go on to be comics, And I think that's sort of key to his personality because, I mean, he was sexually and physically abused in children's homes. But you can just imagine how terrifying it would be to be in that situation when you can't fight and you're 5'2" or whatever he was.
The depictions that we get, we started talking about John Waters and exploitation, how John Waters was interested in the family more than he was in Manson per se. And then as the films continue, Manson himself it becomes much more prominent as a figure. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's sort of strange because this recurs in the Manson family, the Van Beber thing, then the family is the main issue because the actor playing Manson, partly because the actor playing Manson quit the project. And The Girls by Emma Cline is also about, as the title suggests, the girls rather than Manson. But I think there came a point, and particularly when you see the TV movie Helter Skelter, where Manson is the focus, it's all about him. And it's really like you have these two schools of thought, which is one, who's the most interesting? Is it Manson the guru, or is it Manson the con man? Is it the girls who are sort of these brain dead slaves, or are they, the early equivalent of what we now call lone wolf terrorists? People with a cause, however misguided. I think it's weird. The documentary Manson is very, very good for that because obviously Manson at that point was in jail. So this
was made in the 70s, right?
In 73, yeah.
Right.
73 it came out. It was recorded in the early 70s. And you have, you've still got the family, but it's missing, Tex and Charlie and stuff, the ones who are in prison. And it's quite weird how they come over then like some kind of group with a very disturbing sort of weird ideology, why the murders, why abortion, why birth. They've got an answer for everything, and they're there with their guns and their snakes. But it definitely makes one think a bit more about the idea of them as just being these kind of acid-fried killers, or brain-dead slaves.
This idea of brainwashing as well. I mean, I've read several articles which contest the whole, credibility of there being such a thing as brainwashing.
Yeah.
It's kind of one of those things that we say as if it's a thing, but it's actually very difficult to prove that someone has been brainwashed, rather than they're just doing stuff that you don't like, maybe under the suggestion or influence of someone else, but by no means they're doing it willfully, I was, and then when we go into the later 70s, you're really interesting in terms of how films like the Wes Craven film Last House on the Left,
yes,
and then Texas Chainsaw Massacre, sort of both are influenced by Manson, but sort of flip the narratives in some way.
Yeah. I think it's really weird how you've got this. You either have hippie killers or hippie victims, by that time. And I think it's weird because Wes Craven himself referred to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as Mansonite, and it seems weird when you're watching it, but. I mean, people have pointed out that the opening with this is the most disturbing crimes in American history. People watching it certainly then would have assumed that they were talking about the Manson murders. And so it's really weird. You have this. I mean, in Last House on the Left, the victims are trying to buy grass. They're sort of squares who are trying to be groovy. And yet Krug, seems, he's very much his ex-con. The songs which were written by David Hess and performed sound very like Manson's songs. These kind of bucolic, the contrast with the violence. It's like it sort of bled into, I guess like Vietnam or, it sort of bled into so many of the horror films of that period, even the ones that weren't explicitly, to do with cults or mass murders or something.
It's funny how from your description, I was sort of thinking, oh yeah, I get it. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the family that they find would be the Trump voters. They would be, you say it's on Make America Great Again against the woke teenagers who have turned up.
It is like that, yeah. It's like they talk a lot in about the old ways, in the old ways of killing the old, and they are this kind of throwback to this, mythic America. These people turn up in their sort of Scooby-Doo style van, and it's a strange. You've got that thing as well in that which you have in the Manson murders, this idea of city and country, that these weird people come out of the desert and go into the city. And then you have that also in horror movies. You have the reverse, where people leave the city and go, Deliverance or Texas Chainsaw. So you have this, and I think that's still there in America, the way that it's weird how people on Twitter, a lot of right-wingers on Twitter seem really proud to have never been to New York or never been to LA because it's so terrifying. I wouldn't walk. I saw somebody the other day say nobody walks the streets in San Francisco after 5 o'clock. And it's like, they make it sound like Gaza or something. You still have that same, dichotomy between, city and the rural parts.
I think that's so psychological. I've been to so many parts of the world, and sometimes, especially if I'm in a film festival, you'll be told, "Oh, you better stay in the hotel," and it's just like, I'll go for a walk. I'll go for a walk. It'll be fine, and you do, and it's fine. It's more than fine.
Yeah, I found that. I went to San Francisco for the first time a couple of years ago, and I was talking to my sister-in-law who'd been, and she said, "Oh no, it's fine. It's no big deal." Oh, there is one bit. It was a bit like The Walking Dead, and I was like, "What?" But cities. I think often it's the idea of cities as being this place of drugs and violence and stuff. Whereas when you spend any time in any city, you're aware that there are all sorts of problems, homelessness and the like.
Oh my God! Is just, I've been to Whitehaven recently. You don't want to. There are towns in England. There are small towns in England which are like the urban equivalent of a Harry Potter Dementor. They just suck the soul out of you.
Well, I'm from Crewe, so I know all about that, And it's funny because being in LA or New York or anywhere like that was nowhere near as frightening as growing up in Crewe. Partly because there was nothing else to do. When I was young, there was nothing else to do in Crewe except, you were either violent or you were running away from violent people. Gigs were violent, football games were violent. It was just, it's just violence.
Violence was the background noise. Absolutely,
that was it. There's that book called Crap Towns, which is there's some spoof book, and somebody says describes Crewe as the pavements are slick with vomit, and you feel that every moment could be your last. And that's quite accurate. It certainly was anyway when I was there. Yeah.
Excellent. The thing. So we throughout the movie representations, I suppose if we come right up to date, one of the most recent ones was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with Quentin Tarantino. I was sort of taken aback by how much visceral loathing Tarantino had for the family. And it's like the family before they're actually really the family. They in the film they haven't committed the murders yet. They're just on their way to, in his alternative history way. It seems ideological to me. It seems like he's going after them, not just as murderous hippies, but as representative of a movement he disdains.
Yeah, that's what surprised me about the film. I think when I saw it, there's this massive sort of contradiction or conflict between, the sort of Hollywood Western actors and, the hippies, not just the Manson family, but hippies per se. And it's weird because if you look at something like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, the Peckinpah film, Peckinpah was no hippie, but he could see this, casting Bob Dylan and Chris Christopherson and all this sort of thing. There's this affinity he sees an affinity between Western outlaws and, these sort of drug-taking, long-haired people. And it's really weird because Tarantino doesn't seem to have that at all. And of course, he's much younger. And I think there is something, I like the Tarantino film a lot, but there is something really reactionary about it at a time when, family members are going up for parole for the 10 to 15 times, and it being granted, and then it being, knocked on the head by the governor. I get it. I get the kind of revenge fantasy thing, but it's like, I think it's an attack. It feels very much like Tarantino was angry at the 60s.
But do you? I kind of want to say, I'm just thinking specifically about that final, and apologies everybody, spoilers for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood if you haven't seen it. But the fight, and I agree with you. I very much rate the film, but I very much rate. I can really like films and disagree with them, and both thoughts can coexist. Yeah. But I thought there was something almost Elizabethan in the way it was reenacting the murders on the murderers. It was like, we're gonna hang, draw, and quarter you because that's what you are trying to do. We're gonna represent your crimes on your bodies. We're not just gonna kill you. We're gonna literally smash your face in, and we're gonna do that to the prettiest girl of the bunch.
Yeah, is it like I think I can't remember the quote now. There's an Aldous Huxley quote about "There's nothing feels as good as doing terrible things in the name of virtue." Oh, and it felt a bit like that. It's like, you can really, really enjoy this violence because these are bad people and we know what they did and it was terrible. And I kind of like the conflicting feelings to that. It's an interesting film in a lot of ways, but it's like, it was basically, it felt a bit like Death Wish, but, much, much better written and directed, that sort of thing where you want, in Death Wish, you kind of enjoy these people being shot in the back for just pulling out a knife, and then you don't feel good about it after,
By Death Wish 2 and Death Wish 3 and Death Wish 4, you really wish
you really don't feel good.
You wish you'd allowed the stabbing to take place.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the most recent, which is the Netflix documentary Chaos. I think we've both read the book on which this is based. I forget the name of the writer, escapes me, even though he's a participant in the
Tom O'Neill.
Tom O'Neill, that's right. Now, what was your take on the book?
The book, it's a strange book because it's got so much in there. It's like he dug up so much stuff and he thought, I'm going to lay it all down. And some of it wasn't. I didn't think it was new. The stuff about Bugliosi, for example, that he was having illegitimate kids with a cocktail waitress or whatever. I don't think that really proves anything other than, he was a lousy husband. But the idea that, he came up with Helter Skelter because obviously then the murders are much scarier, this bizarre belief system, killing total strangers and all this, that he kind of ignored evidence that flew in the face of that, I thought was really interesting. And that he tried to blacken O'Neill's name, allegedly. That was fascinating. But what I liked the most was the thing about how Manson was much more embedded in the LA scene than is widely thought, and especially the story, which, if it's true, it's really strange. Terry Melcher turning up at the ranch on acid after the murders and begging forgiveness from Manson. That was all really interesting. The MK Ultra stuff, I know that there's quite a lot of really, really strange things going on in Haight-Ashbury at that time. And it would be weird if the CIA or whoever didn't have an interest in what's basically this kind of insurrection in the middle of an American city. But there's also, it seems like all conspiracy theories to sort of try and make sense of something which can't really be explained. And I think that was a problem.
Or which can be explained with far more boring but more credible ideas. Like, for instance, in the film, they talk about this particular doctor who has been conducting experiments,
Yes.
and he's been brainwashing people, and it's kind of one of those. They use the Manchurian Candidate as an example of like, yeah, look, it happened in. But wait a second, Manchurian Candidate is a film. It's not a documented fact that this happened, and it's a film about It's sort of like using Invasion of the Body Snatchers as evidence that people have become pod people. And there's one point at which he says, the author says, why would he said that he had succeeded? Why would he say he'd succeeded if he hadn't? And why would the CIA pay him this substantial sums of money for? The CIA pay lots of crackpots substantial. They're not like they're a secretive organization which is completely riddled with corruption. Of course, there's going to be money going missing and people getting paid for jobs they don't necessarily do. And
of course, and also I think everybody was kind of playing catch up at that time with, you've got these acid experiments, in the late 50s. And I think Morris was interested in that because he made Wormwood earlier, which was also about these CIA experiments. And then, of course, it gets out of control and everybody's dropping acid. And I always think it's weird that it went, what people who went through these terrifying experiences in the acid tests when they were dosed without their knowledge, what they must have thought 10 years later to realize that it was this kind of recreational drug used by millions of young people. And I think I'm not sure anybody knew what was going on. And what I think is notable when you hear Bobby Beausoleil in the documentary as the voice of reason, quote unquote, that is convincing until you realize it's like the fourth or fifth version of the story he's told. I'm not even sure that the people involved know why a lot of these things happen, partly because of people messed up on drugs tend to make really bad decisions. And when you've got, in the Gary Hinman case, what to do, phrases like this, I think that there's a sense which it's ironic that it's called chaos, I think, because he's trying to sort of lay this framework over, these bizarre events, both with the CIA and with the family. I'm not sure they, in retrospect, trying to understand what was going on then is weird. And also, like you said, there were so many flakes and weird people involved. And you get these people, these acid dealers who are working with the CIA. And it was just a really weird time.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you lift the rock of any of these sort of secretive organizations and national security organizations, they're dealing with lots of people who, they've got lots of, any police department will have confidential informers that you would not, if you trace them, and they were paying this guy and he did this, it wouldn't look good. But that's sort of like the messy, murky world that you have to deal with if that's if in law enforcement, even in just very banal, managing a medium-sized city. So I don't know. I think it's I find it as soon as MK Ultra gets named, I find my eyes glaze over, and I sort of like, suddenly people seem to become very gullible because it's a good acronym.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is fascinating, and it is the case, like in the Morris Wormwood thing, that they were dosing people with acid who were falling out of windows. I mean, but I also think about all the President's Men when they suggest, these are not very bright guys and it got out of control.
That's a good quote, yeah.
Yeah, because it seems like the idea of the CIA as being this kind of, like the Illuminati or the Freemasons, as kind of these moving everybody around like they're puppets. And I don't think that's the reality of things, looking at the way that, all sorts of things work out. It's often it's just things get out of control.
And it's different departments, different departments doing different things. I mean, I think one of the best films about the CIA and the national security sort of apparatus is Burn After Reading by the Coen brothers, in which, oh, well, it's superb because it's a comedy about a conspiracy that never happened. It's like a typical Coen brothers where there's no there, and lots of people die, a little bit like Fargo. And it's framed by these wonderful scenes in which J.K. Simmons is like one of the heads of one of the departments, and he's constantly being asked, "Oh, should we arrest him?" And he's going like, "Oh, fuck no, stay right. Should we stop him at the airport? He's trying to escape. Oh, fuck, let him go." It's the least problems that we have, the better it is. We're not interested in any of this.
Yeah. Well, I was reading a book not long ago about the Robert Kennedy assassination. It was things like, well, the police didn't release these photographs of the door with bullet holes in, so this must be a conspiracy. And I was thinking, I remember the Yorkshire Ripper investigation when they were talking to the guy who was the Ripper like 4 or 5 times, and that wasn't a conspiracy. That was, just incompetence. And the idea that something, some screw up somewhere, some photograph not being released or some interview not going ahead is part of some grand design rather than somebody screwing up somewhere is weird to me, and that I think that sort of magical thinking is behind a lot of these ideas, but also it is, as you say, because I think the Manson case lends itself to that, because there is no definitive, we're still arguing about the motive, and so it's ripe for conspiracy.
It's what you said earlier on as well about the use of drugs in terms of perceiving stuff in the moment. It's also about trying to remember stuff, and without getting too philosophical, it seems like there are these moments, these sort of fulcrum-like moments in history, and you want to go back, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Cielo Drive. You want to go back and sort of, and I mean that's what the Tarantino film is very much about. Is if we could go back and just be there and see what happened and see what and if somebody, I mean that's one of the things that was interesting, I thought, in the documentary when I was watching it, is that everybody in that house tries something different. Every victim in that house tries something different. So like most murder situations, you're thinking, well, why didn't you just try to run? Or why didn't you just try to grab the knife? Or why didn't you try to just beg or try to communicate with the person? And they all try different strategies and it all fails. And so it's sort of complete. That's the nightmare for me. Is like there is no, well, why don't you just jump out the window?
Yeah, what I think about a lot is the Abigail Folger seeing, Susan Atkins walking around the house and just waving to her, and she waved back because it was the 60s, and you could easily find somebody wandering around your house barefoot and long-haired, and you'd wave at them. It's I mean, it's a sort of, it is like something out of a horror movie. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's lasted, I think. It is just this really, really terrifying thought of you're there and you're, especially in the case of Sharon Tate, you're young, you're beautiful, you're rich, you're going to have this baby. You're living in this. I mean, that was what was weird when I first went to LA. I really understood. I went to the Getty Center and you're looking out at these. It's like the nicest place on earth. These huge houses with their swimming pools and these incredible views, and it feels like you've made it. And then these psychos turn up, and whether you offer them money or whether you try to flee, they're going to kill you. And it really is the stuff of nightmares. It's a really, really, and I think that sort of elemental aspect of it is often buried beneath the, was Manson a con man or a guru, or was there a conspiracy? Just the sheer horror of the situation.
You mentioned earlier, and I think this would be a good way of moving to Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. You mentioned that like Tarantino is this much more, feels, especially in this film, much more reactionary in that he doesn't have any time for the hippies at all, and it's kind of weird because like the Sharon Tate film that he shows her watching is kind of what he would consider one of the low points of cinema as well. It's this sort of like 1960s formulaic trash that's not in any way in his wheelhouse. obviously doesn't have anything to do with her murder, but culturally that he aligns himself with the TV stars and the sort of second string Hollywood people. But with Peckinpah, there is this sense of the outlaw. There is also a sense that Peckinpah, there's never a problem he's met that he doesn't think violence will somehow solve. And the other Manson, sorry, this is long, but I'll finish now. But the other Manson thing is you mentioned earlier Chris Christopherson being in Pat Garrett. He's also in Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, and I thought his role, because I knew we were having this conversation, I thought his role as one of the bikers who turns up as a rapist, essentially, with a CND sticker on his jacket, is precisely speaks to that sort of moral political confusion that Manson seems to evoke.
Yes, and it reminded me as well of in Dirty Harry, Scorpio with his peace sign belt buckle.
Yeah.
This sort of hideous racist hippie with his peace sign belt buckle. There seems to be quite a lot of that. These kind of, and he's yin and yang, as well. Christopherson on the back of his jacket. Yeah, I mean, I think I described in the book as Manson-ish. I was quite shocked when I saw the film. I watched it before I wrote the book. I rewatched it and I thought, God, he really does look a bit like Charlie. I think Peckinpah, as far as his attitude to things, I think Pauline Kael, who I have mixed feelings about generally, but she knew him quite well, and she said he just wasn't a reasonable person.
Right.
People look at him as this icon of artistic integrity, and I do to a degree. I mean, I get quite sort of angry when people say, oh, he was a drunk or he was really difficult, because, but he made great films. And he did have issues, but I think, that he just wasn't a reasonable person. And I commented on that in a thread on Facebook. And somebody said, oh, I wouldn't take Pauline Kael's word for it. And Monty Hellman came in the thread, the director, and said, actually, I knew Sam well. And Kael is completely right. He wasn't a reasonable person. And I think that's it. It's easy.
Monty Hellman has entered the chat.
It was like that, really. I was trying not to show that I was like really, really, it's one thing. It was like that bit in Annie Hall, when Marshall McLuhan turns up. Here's Monty turning up to save me. But I think that's it. I had this romantic view of, the Orson Welles and Peckinpah and these people, but often they don't help the situation. And I think it was Kael also said he wanted to humiliate people when studio executives. He wasn't interested in winning. He was interested in, humiliating somebody else. And, I think he was a really difficult person.
Yeah, I think there's something to do. There's a like conflict which can be creative, and it can even be motivated by sort of high values. I've got an artistic vision. I will fight everybody until I get what I want. But there is that, and then there is also you just have a shitty personality. you just don't get on with people. You're a bully. You don't like people. I mean, you're doing these arguments in spite of the work rather than because of the work.
Yeah, and I think also that Peckinpah's a pretty good case study in terms of just how bad substance abuse can be for an artist, because there's a collection of Peckinpah interviews, which is a great book. But in the early 60s, he's very kind of, moderate in his views, and he talks very supportively about the people he's worked with, and even people he had problems with. He's very, that doesn't come over in the interviews. By the early 70s, he's really playing the role of Sam Peckinpah. He's very confrontational. He's very funny, which, I think that is often lost because there's not a lot of humor in the films. But he's just so bitter. And maybe, obviously, who wouldn't be with you're having projects recut just so MGM can recoup funds they've pissed away on a hotel. But I think also the alcohol and later on the drugs really took their toll on him, I think.
I think it's one of the things you mentioned in the book that really struck me was, how sensitive, how much he liked Tennessee Williams, and that's sort of something that you're going, hang on a minute, wait a second, Sam Peckinpah. Are we talking about the same Sam Peckinpah here?
Yeah, and I think that's there. I think it's really weird. There's a Barry Norman interview that turns up on YouTube where I think he's promoting Pat Garrett, and he's like a college professor, he's so soft-spoken and so, thoughtful. And you sort of see that when he was sober, and when things were going his way, as obviously, in the wake of the Wild Bunch, he's riding high. But then it didn't always work out. And I think, it's the way that some people deal with disappointment. And he didn't have... This sounds like a euphemism, but he didn't have the best, the most healthy coping mechanism.
No.
So and I think that Alfredo Garcia is partly about that. It's a film about rage.
Well, let's talk about that, because this is a film that I think I've said this so many times on this podcast. Actually, I think I saw this first on Moviedrome. Warren Oates, of course, was in the Wild Bunch, and it's not really a lead actor, but he has a role in Badlands. He's part of the ensemble in Wild Bunch. But then Monty Hellman, he was in Cockfighter as well, which is a very unseen, underrated film. But here he's sort of like a romantic lead, albeit a lead who, after a love scene, gets out and starts cracking lice from his pubes between his thumbnails. Which you talk about talk about not much humor, but I found that very funny.
I just find that weird. It's really like, it's quite an off-putting film in a lot of ways, and it's really like, on some level, it's like, well, violence won't put people off, but this guy dousing his crotch in tequila, which I don't think is actually, I'm not sure that would work. We don't get anything else from the pubic lice the rest of the film, so maybe it does, I don't know. He's very weirdly cast, and because he was a great supporting actor. I mean, he steals Tulane Blacktop, I think. But, loads of people have said this, and watching it again quite recently, I thought he's so much like Peckinpah. The story is that Peckinpah didn't realise that Oates was playing him, which I'm not entirely convinced by. They were Sam's sunglasses he was wearing.
Right.
And I love that he wears the sunglasses in bed, but when he's driving in the bright sun, he doesn't wear them. And it's like, Oates obviously it's an old story with directors, they cast a surrogate, but it's really, really hard in the film when you see Oates, being this kind of loser who's laughed at by all these rich suits, to not see that as how Peckinpah saw his career.
And he's a piano player, he's an artist, and his girlfriend is a singer and a guitarist, and so there's a sense of they're the artists against the world.
Yes, bartender, as they refer to him, so they don't even call him a pianist. They refer to him as bartender. And he is, and, it is the classic, the loser's revenge, the worm turns. What I'm really not sure is how, if we're supposed to see it as, that he does achieve this kind of glorious revenge, because, of course, he dies. It's like, it doesn't seem to be a film that celebrates him fighting back. But then on the other hand, it does feel good when he just starts killing everybody, because he's a really unsympathetic people. Yeah, well, but they are so unsympathetic. The ghastly people in the hotel suite and El Jefe and stuff. There's a weird bit where he says he could have died in Tijuana and never known what it was all about. And it's like, but is this what it's all about? It's not really about money. It's about, revenge on the world.
Well, that's the difference between this and Pat Garrett and also the Wild Bunch is, those are people who are marked for death, and they're cowboys, and ultimately, one way or another, they're going to be got, Pat Garrett, as much as Billy the Kid, it's not just going to, it's going to come to them all. So better to go out in a blaze of glory, fighting, taking them with you. But with Benny, you get the feeling that he could just have turned down the job, and that would be the end of the film. He didn't have to. He didn't have to do this. This is a chance he's taking, and he isn't like. You have a backstory that he's been a soldier, which explains his sort of facility with firearms. But there's no sense that he's like a cowboy or an outlaw before this. He's just working in a bar. I mean, he's kind of the glad-handing American tourist. He's like Richard Burton in Night of the Iguana. He's just the guy who's seeing the bus of tourists. Enjoy your time finding the soul of Mexico, guys.
Yeah, and singing Guantanamera, of course. Which is the
the finest
the tourist standard. Yeah, I mean, I think it's weird because Peckinpah, of course, was in the army, as was Oates. So, he turns down the $5,000 they give him as well. There is a point where he could take the $5,000, which is a lot of money for him, because originally he's after $1,000. And then of course, has been pointed out loads, and it always kills me when he forgets the money at the end and has to go back to get it. When he leaves El Jefes, he takes the head. Come on, Al, we're going home, and then leaves the money. He has to go back for it. So it's, it really isn't about money.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Peckinpah, you mentioned this in the book as well, that Peckinpah saw this as sort of wanted to sell this as a love story, which shows probably how much booze was addling his brain at this point.
Yeah.
Because...
Yeah, go on.
Well, just that there was this love story. There's this love story between him and the woman that he sort of feels betrayed by because of her relationship with Alfredo Garcia, and a lot of the violence is motivated. You've got that almost rape scene. This is many people's problems with Peckinpah, I think, much more than the violence. Is this sort of ambiguous relationship to women who, well, ambiguous, I'm not sure if ambiguous is the word. It's just straightforward misogynistic.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people tie themselves in knots trying to defend Peckinpah's misogyny. But I think Paul Schrader was more accurate when he said that he learned from Peckinpah that you should just, reach into yourself and put it on screen.
Yeah.
And I think there is something really ugly about the way, I don't think it's about women actually, but then that in itself is quite misogynistic. Women are just the collateral damage in the struggle between men. I mean, the bit when she goes off with the Chris Christopherson character, and Benny is left with the Donnie Fritz guy, and he says, so she can handle it. It's like men bond with men even when, the woman they're with is off being sexually abused. And I think that's there in Straw Dogs too, that it's like, men get at each other through violence against women. And women are, this collateral damage of these male struggles. And that's pretty dodgy in itself.
Yeah. I mean, he's being cooked essentially.
And I think he seems fascinated with betrayal of all sorts, Peckinpah. And that seems to be the thing, really. And women are just, another way in which you can be betrayed. Sometimes it seems almost pathological, especially in The Getaway, when this guy's to watch he's literally cuckolded in that, with the Al Latieri character. That just seems like he's, Peckinpah really vomiting up all this sort of hate and fear he's got. And I think that's what makes it interesting. And I'm not sure there's much point in trying to say, oh no, what he really meant was, because there is something pretty ugly about the way women are treated in his films.
Yeah, I mean, he just wants. From what I can see, the repetition is, women are sexually available to me, and that means they're going to be sexually available to everybody. And that's the thing I fear the most. The thing I fear the most is my lover is going to want to have a non-exclusive relationship. And even though that might be something that's okay for me to have, my romanticized view of a woman should be that she loves me and loves me alone. And so you have this uncomfortable feeling where the rape becomes a love scene, where she sort of feels sorry for Chris Christopherson and they start to get it on. And I mean, the 1970s, this idea was kind of rife that there were rape fantasies. It pops up, of course. It's straw dogs and all these ambivalent and then not ambivalent rape scenes. Even Diane Keaton in Looking for Mr. Goodbar, there's this sort of where does sexual promiscuity in a woman lead? Where will it go in a misogynistic society?
I think it's really reactionary. I mean, it's part and parcel of the view of the sexual revolution, I think.
Right.
Once women cast off marriage and family, who knows what's going to happen? Where will it end? In rape and death.
They're eating dogs, they're eating cats.
What is weird, what I think about a lot in Straw Dogs is when people write about it as a rape revenge film, the Dustin Hoffman character never finds out that his wife has been in, I was going to say rape stroke seduction scenes, but the minute you start using phrases like that, you realize just how dodgy the films are, that there is this deliberate confusion. So it's like we see it, we see the Amy and the villagers, but he never finds out. And of course that's not in the book, the source novel. The guy who wrote the source novel, The Siege of Trench's Farm, described Peckinpah as a sick individual, presumably because of that rape scene. Yeah, it was very much... I mean, it was a thing in that period, but it was also something you see particularly in Peckinpah, yeah.
I remember listening to Susan George on the radio once being interviewed about that rape scene and saying it took like 4 or 5 days for them to film. And that's one of the things that knowing how films are made... There are so many moments where somebody can go, are we sure we want to do this? Are you sure you want to put the camera there? Are you sure you want to have this last quite so long? There are so many moments where you could sort of decide to do something else.
Yeah. Well, I think it's weird. I think I might say this in the book, but it's something that I've definitely said it in another book as well, that when you started to get the collapse of the production code and you could start to show sex scenes, how many major directors opted straight for rape scenes? You've got these, it's like we've got this naked woman and we could have a shower scene and we could have a sex scene, but no, we'll have in Clockwork Orange and Straw Dogs and even something like The Devils, where you've got these naked nuns being manhandled and mistreated and tortured. And I know there's the theory that it's some sort of reaction against feminism, but it seems weirder than that often.
Yeah, I remember reading an article, I think it was in the Sunday Times once, that was sort of bemoaning, this was years and years ago, bemoaning, might have even been at the time of the accused, that rape was being put on screen so frequently. And it sort of said, oh, it's a cheap way of having violence and sex at the same time. And I sort of remember thinking, oh, that's sort of nonsense. It's a simplistic way of looking at it. But there are times in the 70s where you do sort of think, Jesus Christ, it was hard to be an actress in the 70s. I mean, you must have been, what page am I getting raped on? Because it's... and even in quite inconsequential movies, not even, it wasn't like the movie's about this.
It's weird because in A Clockwork Orange, it's violence, but it's also straight away it's sexual violence. This isn't, clearly Alex is supposed to be like a football hooligan, but it's so much of the violence is against women and so much of it is quite, lovingly portrayed, lots and lots of nudity and these, I think it's, in Peckinpah's case, it's something almost pathological, but there was definitely something in the culture then. But it's funny when you said Diane Keaton, because I was thinking there's a line where she says in Play It Again, Sam, I'll never get raped, not with my luck. And it's like, and I guess that
it depends on who's doing the raping. Yeah, she has that line, and there's a very funny joke there, which again, there shouldn't be such a thing as a funny rape joke, but she says something like, "Oh, did you hear about the sexual assaults that were happening in Connecticut?" And Woody Allen's character says, "I'd never even been to Connecticut." Which, considering what was to happen later in his private life, it's a massive rings a massive bell these days.
Yeah. I think it was very much it's just interesting that. I mean, I've always thought it's fascinating when the production code collapsed, violence was the go-to for so many directors rather than sex. But then I guess European filmmakers have been, using graphic sex for quite a while.
Oh, I think there is also a sense that I think even today I've seen films very, very recently where the idea of there's this, the most graphic depiction of rape ever sort of. I mean, obviously we've had Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, but even more recently there's been several films that, the names of which, one called Jupiter's Moon or something like that. It's just vile, sort of in your face, absolutely. I'm not sure if Irreversible is necessarily vile, but the actual scenes themselves are vile. And it's almost like, why are these men always proving their bona fides by showing how much they can brutalize women on screen? It just feels to be maybe I'm being unfair, but that almost feels like the subtext. Why is extreme cinema extreme this way, and not some other?
Irreversible's interesting because he does seem to be saying, he's sort of defying you to keep watching.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the case in something like Clockwork Orange. I think, the sort of aesthetics of the film, you're impressed with the filmmaking. It does seem to be, I think, in Irreversible, it's almost like he's saying, I mean, especially in the opening scene, more than the rape scene even, how much of this can you take?
Yeah.
It's a much more effective film than Funny Games, I think, in that sense, because it says, look, how much of this can you take and why are you watching it? Because it's so, and there's the fact that it's like static camera. So you can't even say, as you can in the Singing in the Rain bit in Clockwork Orange, but it's so beautifully filmed. But yeah, I still think it's not going to go away, is it? The sort of brutality of.
No, I mean, as long as it exists in the world, it's part of the world, and it should be there. And I'm not even saying it should be proportionate, because drama is always fed off violence and conflict, so it's always going to be disproportionate to what it is in life. It's like the day-to-day scene with the swimming pool attendant saying nobody drowned. Listing the years. 1977, nobody drowned. 1978, nobody drowned. 1979, somebody drowned. That's where we put the movie. That's where we shoot the movie. Now, your original reaction to Alfredo Garcia was, I think, probably similar to mine, where you thought it was a bit of a hodgepodge and you weren't quite sure. But now, where do you stand on it? What's your?
I think it's brilliant. I think it's a endlessly fascinating film. I read a quote which I would have put in the book, but I only read it recently. Francis Bacon, the painter as opposed to the scientist, said he believed in deeply ordered chaos. And that's Alfredo Garcia, I think. It's a kind of mess. And, that some of the editing is really weird. It feels like it's been, edited for TV in places. Choppy and... But...
Well, I was wondering about the cut I was watching, because I watched a cut off the internet database, the sort of free thing, and it's just under 2 hours. And I was thinking, am I watching a sort of cut version? Because it doesn't seem as violent as usual, and... there's not much slow motion. I mean, there's literally like 4 or 5 shots of slow motion in it, in the whole thing.
A car going through a puddle, which is really underwhelming. That seems deliberate. That is just as self-destructive as Peckinpah's cocaine habit, I think. This casual use, it's like a car going through it. It's like, you want slow motion? Here's slow motion. Yeah. I don't think it's that bit at the beginning where they break. Apparently, it's supposed to be her wrist, although it always seems like her arm. The pregnant. That goes. I find that really, really hard to watch. Actually,
right.
It's a really, that is a really shocking moment of violence. But I think it's sort of chaotic, and it feels sort of slipshod in places, and the narrative is really weird because the first hour it's fairly slow moving, and then in the last 20 minutes you get so many people getting shot, but it's not as good a film obviously as The Wild Bunch, which is a great movie, but there's just something about it's like you really are. People use this phrase "heart of darkness" a lot. About this is a voyage into the heart of darkness, but it really does feel like that, and it feels like you're looking at he said Sam said it was the only pure Peckinpah, and it really feels like that. It feels like right down to the quite strange view of women. It's like this is me for good or ill, and there's confusion and contradiction and the strange kind of. It feels really artless in places, but in other places, like when the bounty hunters first show the picture of Alfredo to Benny, and you hear the sound of a car crash in the street outside, and it's like, wow, it's one of these little moments. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I love the way in the book you talk about sort of the mismatch of the lighting in some of the scenes, and yet at that same time, that might be just Benny's drunk, and so like he blacks out a bit, and day turns up without him expecting it to. And
it is really weird. I watched it again, thinking, was I a bit harsh on the lighting? But no, it's getting
truly
dark.
awful.
Then it's really light,
yeah.
And also it's like some of the shots are so strange because they're shooting into the trees, so it looks much darker than it is. And so you've got this sense of disorientation anyway. And I really don't know, how much of this was deliberate. But it's, I mean, I love it. I think it's got a lot of power. I can see exactly. I mean, partly because I didn't like it when I first saw it, but I can see why it turned up in these 50 worst movies of all time. These kind of books, because superficially, it's not great. But I think it's really a really incredible film. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love Warren Oates in it. I love him talking to the flies and the head, and trying to order an omelette while the head is stinking up the car and stuff like that. It's just the fact that he's ordering an omelette as well is really, really, grotesque.
I like it when the kid says what's in the bag, and he doesn't say dead cat, he says cat. Dead cat. He's got these great lines, and that's it. I mean, there's a sort of poetry to loads of the dialogue. It's really, really kind of beautifully written, but you have to pay attention because otherwise it just sounds like B-movie dialogue.
Yeah, don't you watch me with your goddamn eyes?
That's weird. That's a really strange line. Yeah.
Yeah.
And why? Because it feels so damn good. I mean, that shouldn't work. That obviously, in loads and loads of movies where somebody's shooting somebody, we know they're doing it because it feels good. But to actually have the character say it, that's fantastic. Yeah,
and it's. I don't know. I like the fact it doesn't hang around. I think I prefer it to Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid because I find Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid more of a poem than a film. It's sort of like a series of murders looking for a story. It's constantly about somebody going. It's like Beckett in a way. It's constantly about someone going, I think I'll leave, and then not leaving.
Yeah. It just feels really like a stoner movie. I mean, it's really funny because when you watch things like Slacker and stuff, and these films that have this kind of dope vibe, and Pat Garrett always feels like it just. It's violent, but it doesn't feel violent. It's everything is kind of drawn out and elongated, and I like that. But it's very much, this sort of stone trip to death. It's this really long, and like you say, we know the characters are going to die. I mean, it's even if you don't know anything about them, it's really they're Walking Dead essentially. Yeah.
I rewatched as well Missouri Breaks recently, not having watched it for a long time. So I think I was a kid when I watched it originally. And I feel that's an absolutely unrated masterpiece. I think that's a film that really deserves a reevaluation, including Marlon Brando's just phenomenal. I think it's one of his best performances.
Yeah. No, it's a great film. That's another one that I saw when I was a kid, and I just thought, what? Is it supposed to be a comedy? Is it supposed to be a Western?
He's dressed as a woman.
Yeah, he's singing the love songs to his horse. I just thought it was terrible. And then I watched it 20 years ago or something. And I thought, it's actually fantastic. Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's got another very druggy kind of vibe. And I know that Jack years later said to somebody, it's a wonder I survived that shoot. It was so excessive, apparently. But it feels like that bleeds into the film. It's a film of such, and it's really violent. It's got this really playful tone, but then it's really violent in places. And no, I think it's loads of those late westerns, I think, are still underrated. Partly because the western was, on its last legs, and partly because they just seemed really strange to people who liked westerns. They're not action movies, and they're tonally all over the place. And I think that but there's some really great films there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really amazing rewatching Alfredo Garcia, because it brought to mind also, you mentioned the grifters earlier, Jim Thompson. It felt like, somehow there's a movie a bit like The Truman Show is the best Philip K. Dick movie, which isn't obviously based on a Philip K. Dick, but it's a best movie of an author without being based on their work. It felt that was the best Jim Thompson movie without being based on Jim Thompson's novel.
It's funny, is that because I was talking to somebody, I was arguing online, and I said I like The Getaway.
Monty Hellman.
Yeah, sadly not this time. No. Well, The Getaway I love, but it misses the great ending of Thompson's book.
Absolutely, the cannibalism.
Yeah, and somebody said, but Alfredo Garcia takes place in Thompson's world. It's like he missed it out of The Getaway and then immerses us, in Thompson's world for a later film. And I thought, that's true, actually. That it's, what we miss in The Getaway, we have in spades in Alfredo Garcia. Yeah, it feels like that's, it's, I think in the David Weddell biography, the chapter with about the film is called Into the Abyss. And it feels like that. It's like, right, well, we're going into the abyss this time. It is very, very Jim Thompson, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, listen, Ian, a last question. I'd like to ask you for a recommended film book.
Recently, I read Pictures from a Revolution by Mark Harris, which I bought in a remaindered shop and thought there's nothing I need to know about Bonnie and Clyde and stuff like this. I got this hardback for about 99 cents. And I thought it was great. I loved it. The stuff about Dr. Dolittle in there. Do you know the book?
Yeah. We've had Mark on the podcast as well.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I just thought, I'll skip all the stuff about, maybe read about In the Heat of the Night, but I'll skip the stuff about Dr. Dolittle. I found the book to be fantastic. Really, really good. It felt really like I learned a lot about films that I thought I knew a lot about. And it even sold me on Dr. Dolittle. It really did.
You can think of like Aguirre, Wrath of God, and stuff like that as being crazy productions, but Dr. Dolittle being a crazy production.
Yeah. And I was also I haven't read it actually, but The Studio by John Gregory Dunn. Yeah, because he talks about. And I was reading that when they were making Planet of the Apes, somebody in the studio said, "Oh, one of the operations they do in that's not how you do that operation." And somebody in the screening room said, "Maybe that's how apes do the operation." And it's like, that's Hollywood thinking in a nutshell.
Exactly. I saw a brilliant social media post with the picture from the end of Planet of the Apes, and they said, what's not explained in the movie is how they got the Statue of Liberty and transported it to the Planet of the Apes.
You get a lot of them. There was a really good one about Titanic, where somebody said there's a glitch in Titanic because somebody says, as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and that's from Coolio's Gangster's Paradise, which wasn't released until he...
God bless the internet and all who sail on her.
I really, I've got, on the strength of Pictures of a Revolution, I'll listen to the Mark Harris thing. I bought his Mike Nichols biography, which I haven't read yet.
Yeah. He also did 5 Went to War.
5 came back. Yeah.
Came
5
back
came
from
back.
war.
Yeah.
Which is really good, really well worth a read as well. There's I think there's a Netflix documentary on it as well. Yeah, maybe even Spielberg or Scorsese each did. I've got a feeling there's some sort of high up production on that.
Because I find a lot of the time with film books, I mean, I like David Thompson, but I'm always arguing with him. I know that's partly David Thompson's thing, that he's there. He's provocative.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time when it's film history, it's like I just feel like it's either films I don't care about,
right,
or it's films that I really love, so I've done so much reading about them anyway.
Right.
And that's why the Harris book really struck me, that it's like, a lot of this is my thing, Bonnie and Clyde, Arthur Penn, I love all that. And when you're finding out something new about it, and you're asked to look at a film which, I've seen Dr. Dolittle when I was a kid, and I thought it was rubbish then,
Yeah, right. Before you even knew films could be rubbish.
Yeah, and it also confirms my view of Rex Harrison, which, So that's all I want in a film book, really.
Oh, brilliant! Well, you've come to the right place. Check out the other episodes on the podcast. I'm sure there's going to be some there that you'll enjoy. Well, listen, Ian, thank you so much for taking part in this. It's been a real pleasure putting these two subjects together, these two topics together.
No, I've loved it. No, thank you.